Greetings, folks, and welcome to Canada, eh? Okay, sorry that had to be done. Today we're doing our third little talk on North American English, specifically discussing English in Canada. And I've got a few things that I'd like to address with you during this lecture. I hope you'll find them interesting, and I imagine those of you who come to tutorial on Friday will probably want to talk about some of them, this being, of course, the dialect that most of us speak. As for what Canadian English is, as I've mentioned a number of times before, it is technically a dialect of American English. And the relative uniformity of much of Canadian English lies behind the fact that much of the initial settlement of Canada by English speakers was done out of the American Northeast. So the English spoken in the American Northeast tended to be spread westward gradually over the course of Anglophone settlement. A notable difference, of course, is the Maritime region, which is separated from the rest of Canada by the very large French-speaking region of Quebec. And here, there is a slightly different pattern involved, although, of course, the influx of English speakers, particularly after the American Revolution, was common to both the broad Canadian dialect region west of Quebec and the Maritime region to the east of Quebec. Recently, linguists have started positing that Canada should be considered a fourth North American dialect region, in addition to the American North and Northeast, the American South, and the American West. There are a few reasons for this. One is a phenomenon called Canadian raising, which is something that affects the way Canadians do a number of our vowels. This is something that Americans like to make fun of, and that is actually identifiably Canadian if you are an English speaker abroad. Of course, we also need to discuss Canadianisms, that is, certain elements of vocabulary that are, if not unique to Canada, at least very common here. And it would be irresponsible and not much fun if I were to leave out the particularly Canadian use, of the wonderful word a. Also, there is currently in progress a very recently identified phenomenon, a very recently identified vowel change going on, called the Canadian shift. I'd like to take a few minutes to address that as well, because this is an active change in the language right now. This is an instance in which Canada is differentiating itself from other North American dialects. And finally, I'd like to take a little bit of a trip to the Maritimes, just because, well, you know, this is a maritime university, and many of you are from the region, and I think we should just take a little bit of time to discuss and appreciate the way English is spoken here. And I expect that today's lecture, more than the next lecture I plan on posting, which will be on Australian English, will be the main topic of our conversation during Friday's tutorial. But of course, that's always really up to you. As for what Canadian raising is, it has to do with the way we pronounce a couple of our vowels, or more particularly a couple of our diphthongs. Specifically, we tend to have allophones, that is, variant pronunciations without meaningful differences, for the diphthongs I and ow, specifically as they occur before unvoiced consonants. Before voiced consonants, they tend to remain about the same as they are in General American. Generally speaking, in Canada, these diphthongs, when they are subject to Canadian raising, tend to start a little higher in the mouth, rather than the mid or low range where both of these diphthongs start in General American. And they also tend to be a little shorter. So what is usually realized as a long diphthong in General American will be realized as a short diphthong in Canadian English. So the I diphthong would be pronounced I, and the ow diphthong would be pronounced O. So if you wanted a few examples, and these are probably always a good idea, for the raising of I to I, we have, for example, the word ice, which in General American is more likely to be pronounced ice. Do you hear the difference there? Ice, ice. Similarly, whereas someone speaking General American might like something, a Canadian is more apt to like it. And while someone speaking General American might cut a steak with a knife, a Canadian is more apt to cut it with a knife. But notice with the plural, Canadian raising does not occur. So in the singular, we say knife, that is, the diphthong is raised, but in the plural, which has a voiced rather than an unvoiced consonant, we say knives, just as someone speaking General American would. So in General American, it's knife, knives, and in Canadian, it's knife, knives. Do you hear the difference? You probably do. In any case, now let's take a look at the ow diphthong, which in Canadian English tends to be realized as ow, although there are some variations there that I think I might want to address informally. In General American, for example, if you're laying tile, you will use grout, whereas the last time I laid tile, when I was redoing a hearth in a house in which I lived, I used grout. And whereas someone speaking General American might live in a house, a Canadian is more likely to live in a house. But if you have many Canadians living in many houses, you will notice that again, the vowel, or rather the diphthong, is not subject to raising. So we have one house, but multiple houses. So we use the same diphthong as someone speaking General American in the plural, again, because in the plural of house, the following consonant is vocalized, whereas in the singular it's not. Similarly, if you want to describe someone who's being brutish and rude, a speaker of General American might refer to that person as a lout, whereas a Canadian is more apt to refer to him as a lout. But if we're being emphatic, both the American and the Canadian will be loud in their condemnation of that lout or lout. Because again, the D consonant as opposed to the T consonant are identical except for vocalization, and where there is vocalization, Canadian raising does not tend to occur. Now, I said there were some variations, and this is something simply that I've observed in my own wanderings and residences around the country, and just listening to Canadians speak with something of a professional ear. While the general pattern is, for example, in the ow diphthong, to realize it as ow, sometimes the initial sound is fronted a bit. So rather than living in a house, you might live in a house. And this was actually a pronunciation that was more common in the suburbs of Toronto where I grew up. And in some dialects, the initial vowel sound is really moved over very quickly. So rather than house, it's more like house. This is what Americans make fun of when they say that Canadians pronounce the word house as hoose, which of course we don't. And when I say that more than any other tick of pronunciation, it's Canadian raising that identifies a speaker as Canadian abroad, I've had this pointed out to me abroad on a number of occasions. The most recent was when I was giving a paper at the University of Leeds in Northern England, and a guy just walked up to me and started talking, and he was local. And within about 2 or 3 sentences, he identified me as Canadian, which was actually rather nice because Canadians abroad are often misidentified as Americans. And this person had the ear to the actual details of the accent. So I asked him what it was that gave me away as Canadian, and it was the way I pronounced those particular diphthongs. And he wasn't somebody at the university who was speaking to me as a professional to another professional. He was just a guy on the street. And the next thing he did was ask me for money, because he was homeless. And so obviously, having had that wonderful linguistic conversation, I really did have to offer him something in return. In any case, as I said, that more than any other particular sound detail is what identifies Canadian English as a distinct sound from other versions of American English, or North American English if you prefer. But it's not just our funny diphthongs that set us off from General American. We also have a number of expressions that are, if not uniquely Canadian, at least typical of Canada, and even where they've leaked over into the US, originally Canadian. Here's a list of some that I've managed to find, and of course this isn't exhaustive. And some of these may actually sound a little strange to some of you because each region is going to have its own unique dialect or slang terms, in addition to what is thought of as generally Canadian. Some of these surprised me when I found them. I didn't realize, for example, when I grew up wearing a toque to keep my head warm in the winter, that that was a specifically Canadian thing to do, and that Americans just wore hats. I did not know that a knapsack was a Canadian version of a backpack, or that thongs were Canadian versions of flip-flops. As for a 2-4, this will vary regionally, I've noticed. In Ontario, a 2-4 is a case of beer, because a case of beer is 24 bottles, not the measly 12 that you Maritimers think of as being a case. I think in New Brunswick anyways, a 2-4 is called a flat. As for a Mickey, this also varies from region to region. In Ontario, a Mickey is a very small bottle of liquor. This is basically the airplane bottle, the kind of thing that shows up in a bar fridge in a hotel. I noticed when I came out to New Brunswick that a Mickey was a 375 ml bottle. And I think that is actually the more general usage of the term. And as long as we're talking about alcohol, a 26er, of course, is a 26-ounce bottle of liquor, and a 40-pounder is a 40-ounce bottle of liquor. I guess Americans don't do that either. But if you want to get really big and really loaded, you can have a Texas Mickey, which is a 3-liter bottle or 101-ounce bottle of hard liquor. Of course, we all know that poutine, poutine, or poutin, depending on where you're from, is one of the great Canadian contributions to world cuisine, and I'll fight anybody who says otherwise, as is the donair, which originated, of course, in the Maritimes. You might take your coffee double-double. That is a uniquely Canadian thing to do as well. I guess Americans, if they do want to destroy their coffee that way, will have it with 2 cream or 2 sugar, double cream, double sugar, what have you. I mean, seriously, folks, if you want to drink coffee, just drink fucking coffee. Don't make it taste like goddamn ice cream. Where an American is more likely to drink whole milk, a Canadian is more likely to drink homo milk, and incidentally, we also have this weird habit of putting it in bags. Americans think that's weird. If you're about to get married, in the States, you may go to a bachelor or bachelorette party, whereas in Canada, you're more likely to go to a stag or a stagette. And depending on where in Canada you're from, you may find yourself sitting on a couch, a sofa, or a Chesterfield. Chesterfield sounds weird to American ears. I grew up sitting on Chesterfields myself, but it's also a word I no longer use. It feels antiquated now. I haven't used it in years, nor have I heard it in a very long time. I think it's probably on the way out. But this, of course, is also a usage that varies regionally. The things that go around the edge of your roof, if you have a sloped roof, to catch runoff and direct it towards the downspout, is in Canada referred to as an eaves trough, whereas in the States it would be referred to more likely as a gutter. If you need to relieve yourself in Canada, you go to the washroom, whereas in most places in the States, you go to the bathroom. Both of which are euphemisms, by the way. I prefer the Czech version of this. They simply call it a pissor. I mean, let's be honest, folks, that's what it is. The Robertson screwdriver also is a Canadian invention, and it is in every way superior to the more common Phillips head. Anyone who's ever spent any time doing woodwork will back me up on this. There is no screwdriver or screwhead easier to strip in the world than a goddamn Phillips. Robertsons are much more robust. In Canada, we're more likely to use pencil crayons than we are colored pencils, which is a more common term in the States, although I grew up using colored pencils, but I'm not typical because I'm from Windsor, and as a former girlfriend of mine once told me, who happened to be American herself, this makes you half American. Canadian kids might go tobogganing, whereas American kids are more likely to go sledding, although I've noticed sliding to be a fairly common term hereabouts. If you are playing hockey and you want to dodge around somebody, in Canada you deke, and in the United States you're more likely to dodge. And if you get into a bit of a disagreement, in Canada you're likely to find yourself in a kerfuffle, although this one has leaked south of the border and is becoming fairly common in North American English. Now, if you really want to get your car out of that patch of mud or ice, you just give her by. And giver is one of my very favorite Canadianisms ever. I'd never heard it till I came to the Maritimes, by the way. And this seems to be part of a common maritime speech pattern of using or her rather than it as a direct object pronoun in dialect or slang. Now, here's one that's always been a favorite of mine. What does it mean to say that you are fucking the dog? Or what does it mean to call someone a dog fucker? Well, it's not what you think. And I've noticed over the last few years teaching this course that folks in the Maritimes are not likely to know what fucking the dog actually means, or what a dog fucker is. It means slacking off. So if you're taking a break from work that you're really not entitled to, or not working really hard, you're fucking the dog. If you want to criticize a workmate who's not pulling his weight, he's just a dog fucker. I learned this one, by the way, when I was working as a night shift janitor in Windsor, Ontario, one summer a long, long time ago. I was 18 and saving up money to start my first year of university. And my workmates were a couple of rather rough guys named Jeff. And it was the Jeffs who taught me about fucking the dog. The reason I actually got switched to night shift from day shift in that particular job was that Jeff number 2 had punched the guy I replaced, Lonnie, in the face, after which Lonnie no longer wanted to work with him. One night I asked Jeff why he had punched Lonnie in the face, to which he responded with a blank expression, "I don't know, I just did." Fortunately, they found me entertaining. This, of course, isn't the only dog sex-related slang term that shows up in Canada. One of my favorites also is screw the pooch, which is to really fuck up badly. And don't get me wrong, I do love dogs. I just also love abrasive slang. Now, if some of you have any particular local slang expressions that you'd like to add to the mix, bring them to tutorial on Friday. I will write them down and use them the next time I teach this course. Now, before we leave vocabulary behind, I think it might be fun to take a look at a few maps as well, because of course, Canada's a big place, and there are a number of different regional usages. In southern Ontario, where I'm from, if you're lucky enough to have a summer place, which everyone seems to aspire to, your summer place is called your cottage. Out west, it's more likely to be called a cabin. And I learned when I came to New Brunswick that camp was also a fairly common word, although apparently this is also very common in northern Ontario. Of course, in Quebec and New Brunswick, chalet is fairly common, and this is really no surprise in New Brunswick, it being the only officially bilingual province in the country. One thing I didn't know until finding this map, actually, was that in Cape Breton Island, your summer place, if you had one, is apt to be called a bungalow. One thing I do love about this course is that it always manages to teach me something as well. Another term that seems to have regional currency is the use of pylons or traffic cones. Most of Canada refers to those portable orange obstacles as pylons. English speakers in Quebec tend to refer to them as traffic cones, and traffic cones is the general term for them in American English. Pylon sounds weird to American ears. This is one of the little linguistic details on which my fiancée and I differ. She is from California, specifically from the San Francisco Bay Area, and has an absolutely lovely accent. I love the accent from that part of California. But the sound of the word pylons just grates on her ears. So naturally, good fiancé that I am, I use it every chance that I get. She, by the way, is very attached to the way she sounds as well, which of course is not at all uncommon. And she's decided that if she is out in this part of the country, or this part of the continent actually, because due to COVID she can't cross the border right now. I haven't seen her since March, but that's another story. She has decided that if she ever starts sounding like a Maritimer, she's going back to California for a few months to get her accent back. Well, one day a few years ago, we were just doing something. I forget what we were doing, but we were, I think, cooking together or something like that. And we'd made an adjustment that got what we were doing just right, and she said, quite unselfconsciously, "That'll do her." At which point she covered her mouth and her eyes widened in horror. And I just did a fist pump and said, "Yes!" But, welcome to my relationship. I think we should get on with the lecture. And then there's the question of what we actually put on our feet. Do we wear runners, running shoes, or sneakers? I grew up wearing running shoes. And even after having come to the Maritimes almost 30 years ago, I still find that sneakers sounds weird in my ears, and it's uncomfortable when I say it. I don't have any particular reason for this. It's not a matter of the aunt thing where I'm deliberately holding on to a pronunciation. This one still just seems weird to me. Sneakers, of course, is common south of the border as well, as are runners and running shoes. So this is not just a difference among Canadians. This seems to be a North American difference. This next map, and I think the last one I'm going to show you, has to do with those things that we draw with. Do we use pencil crayons? Do we use colored pencils? Or, if we're from Newfoundland, do we use leads? Which again is a term that I'd never heard of for those things until I started teaching this course. The map, of course, shows general tendencies, and not every usage is going to agree with those general tendencies. Although I'm from an area that seems to be fairly strongly leaning toward pencil crayons, Southern Ontario, I actually grew up using colored pencils. This probably comes from, again, being in a border community with a lot of both physical and cultural backing and forthing across the Ambassador Bridge or through the Detroit River Tunnel. And I do remember when I moved to Toronto and heard people referring to pencil crayons, it seemed weird to me, and quite frankly, it still does, even though my daughter Lindsay refers to them as pencil crayons. It's funny how these things stick with us. And again, it's not a sense of one seeming more correct to me than the other. It's simply a matter of what one is accustomed to, and particularly what one's accustomed to in childhood. And as long as we're on the topic of words and usages, it's probably time to talk about that most distinctive Canadian word, a. Not that we're the only ones who use it, but we seem to use it differently and more flexibly than anybody else. As for what it is, a is what's called an invariant tag. It never changes form, and it can be tacked on to any number of utterances for any number of purposes. And in Canada, we seem to make use of as many of those purposes as we possibly can. Now, outside of Canada, the term does occur in two different usages. One is a request for more information or for the repetition of a statement. So informally, if someone says something to you but you don't quite hear them, you could say, "Eh?" which means, "Come again? Say that again, please." It's also used in a number of dialect regions as a question marker. I think the most common place for it to be used that way outside of Canada is New Zealand. And that's about it. As for where a comes from, we're not sure. I've read one theory that suggests that it comes from the Middle English a or a, both of which occur in Middle English manuscripts, with the usages that I've just outlined for a, that is a request for more information or as a question marker. But I also wonder, and this is just my speculation, whether it may also come from the Lowland Scots I. There is, of course, a strong Scottish influence in Canadian English, and the Scots seem to use I in a number of ways that are similar to how we use a. I have no formal study to back myself up on this one. This is simply an observation I made in the summer of 2007 while riding a bus between Glasgow and Edinburgh and listening to the people around me speak. And there was this Glaswegian grandmother sitting in the seat behind me with her grandson. And as I listened to her, it seemed like almost every second or third word out of her mouth was I. It wasn't really quite that frequent, but it seemed that way. And I started listening to how she was using it, and it was sometimes used in the usages that I've just outlined, It was sometimes used just as a space filler, and it seemed to fill a number of other functions as well, which I didn't have the presence of mind to write down because, of course, in 2007, I had no idea I'd ever be teaching this course. But that's just my own speculation on a possible Scots origin for the Canadian usage of a. As for how Canadians use a, well, there are a number of options, as I'm sure you all know. One is it's just a matter of politeness or inclusivity. That is, if you're making an absolute statement, but tag an a onto the end, you're leaving open the possibility that the person you're speaking with might not necessarily agree with you, might not necessarily see things the same way. So it's a way of seeming less authoritative or less authoritarian, rather. That is, pretty good, eh? Is not at all the same as pretty good, because it leaves open to your interlocutor the possibility that it is not, in fact, pretty good, and you recognize that possibility. Similarly, you're actually leaving open the possibility of a response, even in the case of a command or a criticism. Pass me the Robertson screwdriver, or pass me the Robertson screwdriver, eh? Are not the same utterance because the one explicitly leaves open the option of refusal. Another usage is seeking common ground. That is, I might say, nice day, eh? Meaning not just that I think it's a nice day, but that I'm implicitly asking whether you too think the day is in fact nice. That is, it's an openness to community and a decentering of my own authority, which is actually quite typical in many ways of Canadian manners, if you want to look at it that way. We are notoriously polite by American standards, and one of the reasons that we come across as polite is that we tend to instinctively leave open in our patterns of speech the possibility for disagreement, for difference, in ways that are less common in everyday American usages. This is not to make a value judgment, by the way, it is simply an observation of fact. And another fact is sometimes when we say a, it doesn't mean a damn thing. It's just there to take up space while our brain catches up with our mouth, and we're able to get on with the next sentence. Or if you wanted to break it down even further, here are 10 distinct usages of the word a, and you can only get most of these in Canada. One, as I mentioned on the last slide, is that it could be tacked on to a statement of opinion. So, a nice sentence for 2020, the age of COVID, might be, those Americans are fucking plague monkeys, eh? Or on a related note, we can use it as a statement of fact. It goes over there, eh? Or those Americans are fucking plague monkeys, eh? We might also use it as a tag in a command. Again, its function seems to be leaving open, at least rhetorically, the possibility of refusal. So it comes across as being more inclusive than simply uttering a command without the a tag added to it. Open the window, eh? Think about it, eh? Wear a fucking mask, eh? Turns the command verbally into an invitation. It makes it friendlier, and therefore draws the two speakers implicitly closer together. Or we could simply use it as an exclamation, as I said, what a game, eh? Which again leaves open the possibility of disagreement. Another usage is to tag it on to the end of a question. So, what are they trying to do, eh? The a here is also very inclusive. It's almost like throwing your arm around someone's shoulder and bringing them into a private conversation. And just as with a command, it leaves open the possibility of refusal, I think when it's added to a question in this way, it leaves open the possibility that the person you're speaking to may actually know the answer. That is, it implicitly lifts them up a bit. At least that's how it strikes me. I could be wrong. It can also mean pardon. That is, it can also be, as I said, seeking of more information. Eh? What'd you say? As in, say that again, please repeat yourself. We also have it in a number of fixed expressions. Things that are more or less fossilized. Thanks, eh? I know, eh? These just come out automatically without really a lot of thought, but they tend to come out in Canada more often than anywhere else. And even when Canadians are insulting each other, we can sometimes be rather nice about it. You're a real snob, eh? I am, at least in calling you a snob A, leaving open the possibility that you may not in fact think you are a snob A, while making perfectly clear at the same time that I do think you are. But if you disagree, I'm open to that conversation. It can also be used to emphasize an accusation. You took the last piece of cake, eh? Which again is not completely meaningless because it at least invites you to make either a denial or an explanation, whereas the bald accusation does no such thing. And finally, as I've already kind of hinted at, it can just be a filler. That is, we have something called the narrative A. It's just there, it doesn't mean anything, but it's part of the rhythm of speech. So this guy's up on the 27th floor, eh? And then he gets out on the ledge, eh? So I says to him, "What the hell are you doing out there? She's windy as fuck. Take my hand, eh, and come on back in." But the truth of the matter is that A is in decline. Yes, that definitive Canadian syllable, the thing that identifies us around the world, does seem to be going away. There are generational, educational, gender, and regional differences in the uses of it. So we'll just run quickly through those. 1, younger people tend not to use it as much as older people. This seems to be true across genders and across regions. Similarly, use of A declines as education increases, and it is more likely to be used in rural communities than in urban ones. Well, let's just jumble those three together. The associations of A tend actually to be with older, uneducated rural speakers. So there seems to be among younger speakers a self-conscious desire to distance themselves from that demographic. That is, the use of A has come over the last few decades, actually, to be seen by younger speakers as a marker of being kinda hickish. And therefore, for anyone who wants to seem urbane, sophisticated, educated, or just generally all around polished, A is something to be avoided. Unsurprisingly, then, we find that it is far more common among men than among women. We've discussed this before. Women tend to speak up, men tend to speak down. This pattern is apparent in the use of A around the country. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't other things that do the job that A does among younger, urban, and largely educated and female speakers. Depending on where you go, you might encounter yeah, as is fairly common in the West, or you might encounter right, as is fairly common in the Maritimes, and sometimes you'll also encounter okay. Additionally, A is more common in the West, particularly in the rural West, than it is anywhere else in the country. It seems to be least common in the eastern urban centers, where, as I said, its use has been in decline for the last couple or few decades anyways. Probably really since Second City TV's Bob and Doug McKenzie sketches from the late 70s and early 80s, which made a self-conscious pop culture phenomenon that identified frequent use of that word with backward, rural, uneducated, hickish types. And as for the origin of those skits, and I think I might put a link up on the Moodle page just in case some of you are too young to remember what that actually was all about, which probably all of you are. I seem to recall hearing, and this is just hearsay, I can't vouch for it, that the reason they actually came up with that skit was that their producer was criticizing them for not having enough Canadian content, and their response was basically, "Oh, you want some Canadian content, eh? We'll give you Canadian content." In any case, that is the story of A as it unfolds in Canada ever so briefly. And this brings us around to one final linguistic development for the day, yet another vowel change. This one is called the Canadian shift, and it is brand new and in progress. It was first recorded in the 1990s, actually I think in the mid-90s, and it seems to have been triggered by the caught merger, which opened up the articulation space in the low back part of the mouth. Now, as I'm pretty sure I've mentioned before, the articulation space at the extremes of the mouth, so the upper front, upper back, lower front, and lower back, are sort of prime real estate phonetically speaking, and when, for whatever reason, one of those spaces opens up, it doesn't tend to stay open for long. Other sounds will drift in to fill in that vacuum. This is what's happening with the Canadian shift. So it can basically be defined as a lowering and backing of the front vowels. Or in other words, exactly the opposite of what's going on in the northern cities shift. And very often you'll see communities, border communities, where on one side of the border, the northern city shift is driving vowels up and forward, and on the other side of the border, the Canadian shift is driving vowels down and back. So these communities are simultaneously drifting further and further apart from each other in terms of their phonetics, in terms particularly of their vowels. And if you want to know what this sounds like, it works something like this. We'll start with the word bag. Now, in general American and in Canadian English up until about the 1990s, this word sounded about the same. Bag. That is the low mid-front vowel indicated by the IPA symbol of the ash. In the Canadian shift, this moves back in the mouth and down a bit and sounds more like bag. So from bag, we have bag. On the other hand, for comparison, we can throw in the northern city shift, and from there, from bag, we have bag. So you can hear and feel, if you try saying them both, that one is going up and forward and the other is going down and back. Well, this movement of the ah vowel towards the ah vowel opens up that space as well, doesn't it? So the word beg comes to sound more like bag. So you don't beg for more, you bag for more. Subsequently, the articulation space of a being vacated also wants to be filled. So the I vowel, that is the high front lax vowel, drops down further in the mouth. So rather than something being big, it would be beg. And rather than ordering a glass of milk, you might order a glass of milk. And rather than having a big bag of bagels, you might have a big bag of bagels. The first time I noticed this was in grad school around about 1995. Didn't realize it was actually a named thing at the time, but I had a friend who was from Ontario, as I am, but I seem to not be affected by this shift. But Andy would refer to bagels rather than bagels. And it annoyed the crap out of me, just because I'm ornery. And I was talking to him about it one time, and I'd never heard that pronunciation before, so I was curious, and I asked him about it, and he didn't know what I meant. He couldn't hear the difference. And even when I said bagel and then his pronunciation bagel, he could not hear the difference. He couldn't tell the difference between beg and bag. And this is something that has been noticed, actually, formally, by people studying the Canadian shift. A lot of speakers who are participating in the shift don't recognize that they're doing it. That is, they sound one way, but think they sound another way. This is something, by the way, that has also been noticed in the Northern Cities shift. And you may recall in the Northern Cities shift sound clip that I gave you, the first speaker, who was a speaker from Chicago, if I recall, couldn't hear the difference between the way she spoke and the way the person interviewing her, who was speaking General American, spoke. This is really interesting, that we often think we speak the way other people do, the way we're used to hearing, and don't even hear the changes that we ourselves are articulating. Now, as for who is actually speaking this way and where they live, the Canadian shift is more common in the West and in Ontario than in Atlantic Canada. And it's more common among younger speakers, but not exclusive to them, and seems to have initially been driven by young female speakers, both in Ontario and in the West. And it's sufficiently developed now that if you have an ear for it, I noticed this maybe 2 iterations of this course ago. I had a student who was from around here and actually was friends with the daughter of one of my friends, but whose speech patterns, particularly regarding the Canadian shift, indicated that she had probably spent some time out west. So I asked her about that, and yes, she had in fact lived in Vancouver for a few years. Now, I don't say this to just impress you with how sensitive my ears are, but rather to point out that the English of Central and Western Canada and the English of the Maritime region, which have always been distinct, seem to be diverging a little bit more. Either that, or the Canadian shift is simply not as advanced in the Maritimes as it is further west. It'll be interesting, I think, to listen to how speech in the Maritimes evolves, particularly among younger speakers in the cities in the Maritimes. Because if that speech pattern is going to catch on in this region, that's where it's going to catch on, and that's with whom it's going to catch on. And I wouldn't be surprised to see, or rather to hear, in say 10 or 20 years, speakers in Fredericton, for example, or also in Halifax, which is a more cosmopolitan place, sounding a little bit more like their Central and Western Canadian peers than they do right now. But this is just a tentative prediction. I'll be curious to see how it plays out. But of course, something completely different could happen. Given, though, that the Maritimes also have taken part in the Cot-Cot merger, I think it's more than likely that eventually the Canadian shift will catch on here. Again, first among young urban female speakers, but gradually working its way out into the broader language community. And now I think, as much as I had intended to follow this general Canadian bit up with a brief exploration of maritime English, as I speak into this microphone now, I have just finished editing the slideshow up to this point, and it's about 10 after 2 in the morning. So what I'm going to do is post the lecture as I have it so far, and then tomorrow afternoon post a follow-up that is exclusively on maritime English, and then the following day do the scheduled lecture on Australian English. So there'll be 3 lectures this week, just so that I can get a bit of sleep between now and when I have to do some real-time classes tomorrow morning. I hope that's okay, and I apologize if my time management skills are not up to the current demands of my profession. I hope you're all doing well, and I hope you find this talk interesting as far as it's gotten today, and I do hope you enjoy the 2 follow-up lectures that are to come. As always, of course, I look forward to speaking with you on Friday. Bye for now.